All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being on time. Appreciate that. I wanted to let you know that you are in session CCB0314. So if that's not the session you intended to attend, let's check on that now. The title is Developing a Reusable Code Architecture for ServiceNow. Write once, run anywhere. All right, please take this time to mute your cell phones. And our presenters will take it from here. We've got Dale Stonell Malore and Dan Spada.
Thank you. So yes, we're here to talk about a reusable code architecture. So specifically, what we're going to cover in today's session is about the different ways that you're able to build on the ServiceNow platform. We're going to talk you through our reusable code architecture and some of the concepts and practices that we've adopted internally. And then Dale over here is going to talk you through some of the specific code examples, and we're going to run quite a few demos today to show you what you can do with your system based upon what we've learned and we've implemented ourselves. So first of all, a little bit about myself. My name is Dan Spada. I'm a technical architect. Been working with ServiceNow about 6 years now, 13 years in enterprise service management, and more recently with HR. So my passions are really around non-IT. Really enjoy working in HR and growing ServiceNow to the broader community within organisations. I'm joined here today with my colleague Dale.
Hello, my name is Dale. I've been working with ServiceNow for about 5 years, mostly with integrations, but also just general. I also have a cold today, so if you could bear with me, appreciate that.
Vegas, eh? All right then, so we work for a company called Kinetic IT. So it is a privately owned managed services provider in Australia. We have around 1,100 staff across Australia, and we support about 2,500 locations ourselves. So we work across many industries through government, public and private sectors. And we are a managed services provider, so we provide a very broad range of services. So really what's most relevant to you guys today is our process and our ServiceNow practice that we have internally. And we use ServiceNow at our customer sites, as well as internally, to underpin the broad range of services that we provide. So for us, it's imperative that we have a reusable code architecture to ensure consistent delivery and best practice aligned delivery across our full customer base, which does span right across Australia. So what you'll learn, what I'm really hoping you can take away from this session is what best practice already exists with ServiceNow and how you can leverage it to create your own reusable code architecture. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can create your own reusable code libraries within ServiceNow. And then, like I said previously, Dale's going to talk you through what we've built with some very targeted demos that cover different parts of the ServiceNow system. So first of all, let's talk about the tools of the trade. So ServiceNow has so many different ways that you can build on the platform. You know, I put 9 up here because, you know, putting 9 on a slide looks kind of pretty, but generally speaking, if you have a requirement, there's going to be many different ways that you can build on the platform. So how about, let's do a show of hands, right? So if I wanted to make a field read-only in ServiceNow, who would do that via a client script? Put your hand up if you'd make a field read-only via a client script. Yep. So you can certainly use a client script, and that's going to work. It's certainly going to work when you're using the fulfiller interface. You know, you could also use a UI policy. That's also going to work via the fulfiller interface. But put your hand up if you'd use an ACL to make a field read-only. More of you. Excellent. That's the answer I like. So within our organisation, we have a server-first policy. So if we do it via an ACL, that means that that particular requirement, so that field being read-only, is going to apply not only through the fulfiller interface, but if we had a REST integration, it's also going to enforce that to be read-only as well. If we had other types of integrations and interfaces, that would also be read-only through that method as well. And it's not that there's a right or a wrong way with building with ServiceNow. There's some ways that are better or worse, really depending upon what your requirements are and how they might change in the future. So let's try another one. If I had a requirement to send an email notification to the requester when their incident is resolved. So you could create a notification record, and you could have a condition in that notification record that said, where the status is resolved. Put your hands up if you think that would be a fairly good way of meeting that particular requirement. Yep, and we do that a lot ourselves. I've seen many implementations where you would use a status check on a notification record, and that is a perfectly acceptable way of meeting that particular requirement. And to be fair, in most cases, that's probably the way I would do it. But if we're thinking about how we might change and grow our requirements over time, we might have a notification record that waits for an event to be fired. So by firing an event, and that event firing on a status change, means we can have many different actions and whatnot happening as a result of that event being fired. So that means we might invoke a web service call. We might send multiple notifications. We can start to store these events that happen within our ServiceNow system as events and then just build the logic that's going to fire, instead of having to go and manually maintain all these different notification records with a single condition. So really, depending upon the requirements, and also to a lesser extent, the user experience that you want to portray, you might choose to go one way or another. An experienced developer can really look at all of the options that are presented, everything in our tools of the trade over here, and work out which is the best fit, not only for now, but where we want to go in the future with our ServiceNow development. And especially as we start to grow ServiceNow, not only in IT, but through the enterprise, these design decisions that we make up front are critically important to the success of our use of the platform. And like I said, we have a server-first policy. We try to minimize the amount of work that the clients have to perform. Things like business logic, mandatory fields. We try to define that as close to the server as possible, or the database as possible, so that they span as many use cases as possible. Obviously, there are going to be some exceptions to that, but that's okay too. So what is best practice? So best practice are really lessons learned to prevent bad code. And we've actually got a lot of different best practices that we can choose from. So ServiceNow, I've put a few URLs on the screen up here. ServiceNow have a technical best practice white paper. This talks a lot about how you can build on the ServiceNow platform and certain approaches that you might choose to leverage to build. There's ebooks. There's also generic and general coding practices. So, if you're a Java developer or a JavaScript developer, there's many books that tell you how you should write JavaScript, how you should write C#. And if you were to try and take all of these different best practices and merge them into one, you're going to have a real bad time. Not only that, there's architecture best practice as well. Within your organization, you might have an enterprise architecture team that try to mandate you working in a certain way, which fundamentally goes against the way ServiceNow works, against the way some of those coding best practices are aligned. And not only that, you might have company or corporate standards that you need to align to as well. So you can't just pick up one book or one person's recommendation and build a reusable code architecture from that. You need to open up, look at what's out there, and work out what is a good fit for your organization. Now, I did want to have a bit of a plug here. So that last link there, the ServiceNow Development Handbook, is written by a guy called Tim Woodruff. He's a very active member of the ServiceNow community. And he's got some very good guides on actually how you go about scripting within ServiceNow. So if you had certain requirements, how and why you might go and build in that particular way. And within our organization, we've all read that book because there's a lot of good practices there. But unfortunately, our best practice architecture incorporates more than just scripting. It's approaches, it's methodologies. So you have to reach further to work out what it is that you want to incorporate into your best practice architecture. So I've spoken a lot about what is a reusable code architecture. So let's take a moment now to talk about what our reusable code architecture is and what principles we had when we were coming up with it ourselves. So our architecture promotes consistency. We didn't want developers writing code in different ways. As a fairly large organization, and certainly with a fairly large ServiceNow development practice, we need to make sure that if one developer writes code, that another person can pick that up and run with it. We need to make sure we all have the same ways of working. It needs to promote reusability. So we don't want to write code for one specific use case. We want it to be reusable for multiple scenarios. And not only that, we might want to make it reusable across instances. You know, if you support multiple customers, you don't want to have to go and pick up a script and modify certain values in it. You know, parameterize your code, make it reusable. Abstract out functions. So I'm sure a lot of you have created helper libraries already. Don't tie yourself to what these libraries do specifically. Make sure that they can grow and change over time as your requirements change. So if you had a processing script and it outputs a data payload, you know, it might output XML now, but what about if you wanted to make that output a JSON string instead? You know, so from an output perspective, make sure that the way that you're outputting text from a script, maybe you've got a method that passes the output in a separate function to that of the processing to generate the payload in the first place. It needs to promote technical efficiency. So we don't want our code to perform or to cause any bottlenecks in performance. So what I mean by that is recursive database calls. We don't want to have a while statement that goes and queries the database 40, 50, or maybe 100 times to get data. Can we incorporate that into a single query and return it in a single payload? We want to minimize the technical debt that we introduce into our ServiceNow environment. We don't want to write code that's going to be quickly redundant. Don't build a feature that you know is going to be in an upcoming ServiceNow release. We need to make sure the code that we do put in there is valid. And lastly, it forms part of our staff onboarding. So this really comes back to point number one. We're working in a similar way, but we need to make sure we educate our entire ServiceNow development practice on the way we work, on the architecture that we align to. Because your best practice code architecture is only as good as the people that are using it. Now, that said, there are always exceptions. You know, a lot of us here are IT people and we have incident and problem processes. There's always exceptions to those processes, and our best practice architecture is no exception to that. So it's okay to deviate from your best practice for some specific use case, but that should certainly be the edge case. You know, 5–10% of the time max. But just make sure you document it. Make sure you documented why you did it and how you did it as well. So I've talked a lot about our team, how we support people, how we support our customers. We've really got 3 levels of personas within our ServiceNow practice. We've got our administrators. These are typically a BAU role. They fulfill requests, they handle support calls. They don't generally have a lot of coding experience. They might be able to write some scripts, but they're really there to perform basic platform tasks. And within our organisation, that's a great entry point into using ServiceNow. You get so much familiarity across what the platform does, how it does it. You know, support is a great way to get started in ServiceNow because you do have that exposure to so many different parts of the system. The second role is the implementer. So this type of role typically has a scripting experience, basic scripting experience. They will likely come, or this is our findings anyway, from like a web dev background or other application support function. And these guys have sat a ServiceNow training course. They understand conceptually what needs to happen, how the platform operates, but they need to be trained up in specifically how ServiceNow operates. Be thrown in the deep end, work with customers, and really understand how the platform hangs together. So interestingly here, we're not talking about writing hardcore scripts here. So lastly is the developer. Now within our organisation, these people typically come from a programming background. You know, so they've moved away from C# development or Java development and have started working with ServiceNow. And interestingly, their strength really isn't in the implementation perspective of ServiceNow. It's more about how you'd go and write these script includes, how you'd write this really abstracted, well thought out code to work with the platform. So the implementers and the developers really work together. And with time, these resources can combine I know you'll get some great technical consultants within your space in ServiceNow. But there's a learning path, especially if you're a customer of ServiceNow, to start to build up this experience within your organization. So it's really important to know your team and work to their skill sets. You know, you can't throw someone in the deep end and expect them to be a developer if they haven't got a scripting or a programming background. You really need to know your team and work to their skill sets. So what is good code? So we took the time to define it and document it, and this is our definition of what good code is. So it's reusable. We understand the requirement, and we've planned for the future. We know how it might change in the future, and it's been written in such a way that it will grow and can be adapted and not break. As you do upgrade, you want to make sure you've got that backwards compatibility as well. It's documented. Your peers are likely going to look at your code. You need to make sure they can look at it and understand what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. It's upgrade compatible. So if you do write a script, you know, it may still be within the realms of configuration, or it may be customization, but you want to make sure that it's not going to go and break when you do a ServiceNow upgrade. So make sure you use current and documented APIs. You know, I've seen some customers that have gone trawling through ServiceNow to find references to ServiceNow internal methods and have used them. You know, again, you can have a pretty bad time. Make sure that it's necessary. Make sure the code that you write can't be met by out-of-the-box functions or methods. It's a very extensive platform. You know, every time I've got a requirement, I'll go on the doc site. I will see if there's a little feature tucked away somewhere that's going to do exactly what I want to do. It's a lot cheaper to implement out-of-the-box functionality than it is to build something from scratch, test it, maintain it, support it. And lastly, make sure it's been peer-reviewed. You know, it's not about getting someone to mark your homework for you. It's about getting another set of eyes over what it is that you've built. Because the great thing about developers is you can come up with a unique way to solve a problem. And it's not that you're right or wrong. It's just that those multiple people coming together to talk about how something can be built provides great value to an organization, because you've got all of these great minds that can work together. Sorry about that. So refactoring code. Let's have another scenario. So when a caller is set on the incident's caller field, set the caller's location from the incident record, from the user record on the incident. Now, that's a fairly basic requirement. And in fact, that script there on the right, that's an out-of-the-box script with ServiceNow. It's called set location to user. And that requirement, when a caller is set on the incident's caller field, set the caller's location from the user record on the incident, it meets that requirement, absolutely. But what happens if I wanted to use this elsewhere? I've got to pick up that 19 lines of code, copy and paste it. It'll work, but it's not really scalable, it's not really reusable. Let's say I did do that. What about if my requirement changes? So let's just say we've changed our organization structure and changed the way we reference locations within our organization. So we've got a tiered approach. And I no longer want the individual location, I want the parent location. Everywhere where I've copy and pasted that script, I'm going to have to go and update that to reference the parent location. You know, there's ways to search. You know, you can certainly do it fairly quickly, but it'd be better to be able to rewrite this in a more modular way. What about if I wanted to get the location and the phone number? So I'm not sure how many of you are technically in the room, but what this is doing is it performs a lookup on the server, it returns the object, and then we'll present that back to the user. It's then going to do another call to the server to get the location friendly or the display name. So interestingly, this script here, my requirement is to get the caller's location. What I'm actually going to get is the full glide record object. So you can see here there's probably about 30 fields there that I actually don't care about to meet my specific requirement. The only thing there that I care about is that location field. And to be fair, that's actually not what I want to show to my end user. I want to show them the friendly name. What is the name of that location? So that's where it's going to go, and it's going to do another query, and it's going to return that name. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to my colleague Dale, who's going to talk you through how we can rebuild this in a more effective way. And for the remainder of this presentation, Dale's going to talk through some very specific examples about what we've done to build our reusable code architecture. Maybe. Ah, perfect.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So just to look at the client script that we were just discussing. This is the out-of-the-box one that populates the location on incident. We can see that it's using a getReference glide form method here with a callback to the setLocation function. So what I'm going to do, just to really reiterate exactly how much information we get back from that call, is to open up a JavaScript execution window on an incident form. You can do this on any form in ServiceNow by pressing Control-Shift-J. So just to put in the script from the client script record there, I'm going to save it to the description. And I'm going to save the entire object. And because it is an object, I'm going to stringify it. And you can add a couple of extra parameters to stringify just to pretty print the JSON payload. Also, I should note that with gform set value, there's actually an option for a third parameter, which is the display value. And out of the box, this client script doesn't do that, which is what forces the server to receive a second call in order to populate the actual display name in the location field. So if I run this, okay. So the description has been overwritten with that entire payload containing a lot of information that we don't need for this particular task. So what we needed to do was investigate a way to apply our principle of reuse and also make this a bit more efficient and only return the values that we require and also return the display values so that we prevent any recursive lookups. So one of our developers named Paul Morris has contributed to our scripting library by coming up with Smart Ajax, he's named it. And it performs this same function, except it's reusable in that it's captured in a UI script and also a script include, which can be invoked from any client script used throughout the system. So if we just have a quick look at the UI script, it takes in multiple parameters, so you can request multiple values from fields and populate multiple fields as well. But for this example, I'm just going to recreate the population of the location. And not only is this reusable, it's also easier for future development by admins to incorporate into their scripts because it's just a single line of code that's required to perform the task. So once again, I'm going to open up the JavaScript execution window, and the G_Ajax is calling our UI script. We're using setValue, which is a method within our UI script, and we're passing in these parameters to say what fields do we want to look at and what field on that record do we want to pull in, which is the location, and what field do we want to populate on the form. And if I run that now, we can see that it has populated the field. And because we are returning a display value, it didn't have to perform another lookup just to get that. So that's my first demo.
Wow, so that's really good. So we're only doing one search to the database to actually return that and display it. We're not getting that full payload back of the full glide record object. So it means it is going to perform much faster within your organization.
Yep. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to look at was adding things to existing records within ServiceNow to make development and maintenance a bit easier going forward. So the demo I'm going to show you is how we reduced the amount of code we needed to use in scripted metric definitions by adding a condition builder to the form. So with metric definitions, they're used to measure performance in a more granular way than SLA definitions can. And they gather data as records such as tasks are updated. And you need to configure them to fire based on the condition, the criteria that the record being assessed is currently in. So has the assignment group changed to a certain value? If so, then start counting. And if it changes away from that value, stop counting. So that's good for basic durations of field values, but sometimes you need more involved and more complicated criteria for when to start and stop counting. So we did this by adding only one new field to this metric definition record. There are a few dependencies on the condition builder, but that's already provided for in metric definition, which makes it a good example of a small change making work going forward much easier. So this condition builder is a custom field that we have added. It requires a dependent value, which would be a table name, and that's already present on the metric definition form. So if I put in the incident table, we can see that the condition builder refreshes and all of the fields on that table are available. And you can define your conditions based on just using the familiar condition builder that most ServiceNow admins use every day. In order to actually execute the condition, we're using the glide filter ServiceNow API function. Glide filter has a check record method, and it requires two objects. It requires the record being assessed to see if it matches the criteria defined, and it also needs the criteria. So we can pull the criteria from this record, the definition record, which is an object that is provided in the metric definition already, and so is the current record. So we already have everything we need to actually utilize a condition builder on the metric definition. And we've added this to the standard boilerplate script, so it's optional whether developers want to use it or not. And the condition builder has no effect if glide filter is not called. So it doesn't affect any pre-existing, predefined metric definition records.
So that's a really good way, Dale, of taking what would be a pro-code concept and making that a low-code concept, which means it might not be a developer that needs to go and write a script. It could just be an implementer that goes and leverages the condition builder instead. So in turn, that's going to be easier to support and maintain, and it's also going to be much more visual. You don't have to go and read a line of code. You can just look at that condition builder there. And the way you can go and leverage this across any different type of table to extend these queries will mean that it's going to be much easier for you in the future.
Yep, that's right. So my third demo is going to be on SLA definitions. So SLAs are very important for organizations because it's their primary measure of performance. And with catalog items, you often want catalog items to have their own SLA definitions. But what can commonly occur is you create an SLA definition record. So a developer's first impulse may be to create an SLA definition record that has a ton of start conditions that says catalog item is A, B, C, D, and that would work fine initially, but it could be a risky proposal for maintenance. So if an SLA on one item needed to change to something else, you would need to modify the SLA definition, which could affect all of the other items that are currently included in that condition. So what we did was we wanted to leave SLA definitions alone once they've been defined, and actually control SLAs from the catalog item level. So we've extended the catalog item table to include a custom form, a custom field called SLA definition in this case. It's just a reference to SLA, the SLA, contract SLA table. So by doing this, we can simply create a new SLA definition and save it. Better actually make it somewhat valid. And put it on request item. Okay, and in the start condition, we can just use some dot walking so that the SLA can look for references to itself on the catalog item table. So it's currently looking at the requested item table. So we dot walk to item. And we find that custom field that we've added. And we can just put in the name of this SLA definition here. Okay, so what this means is that we can add that SLA definition to any number of catalog items. If we need to change a catalog item's SLA, we can just do that from the catalog item itself, and we don't have to test all the other items that are associated to that SLA.
So that really means we don't have to define all of these separate SLA conditions and test them every time we build a new catalog item. You can build that SLA definition once and then go and link that to the items that it's applicable to, and you'll be able to see from that item whether it's linked or not. So you don't have to go and test every SLA on every catalog item, which is going to reduce your test effort and reduce your implementation time.
Great. So for my final demonstration, I'm going to be talking about another way that we've extended the catalog item form, and that's to handle approvals. So approvals are foundational in catalog items, and we've found in the past that we constantly just recreate approvals in each workflow. So it's very easy to just do the same work again and again, and that doesn't really apply our principles of reuse. So what we've done is we've utilized workflows, subflows, and parallel flow launches. So we know what types of approvals we need, what are the most common, and whether approvals are even required at all. So we've added a select box to the catalog item form. So as new approval types come to light, we can add new ones here. If we need to deactivate one for whatever reason, we can also do that and switch the catalog item to no approval required. I'll demonstrate how this feeds into actually triggering approvals in a second. One other element we added was a new field, a custom reference field that just points to workflow. And this second field will hold our actual fulfillment workflow. So once all of our prerequisite tasks, such as approvals or anything else that needs to take place before actual service is ready to be delivered by a fulfiller, before tasks get assigned out to assignment groups, we put our core foundational workflow in the primary pre-existing workflow field. So any catalog item that gets submitted will use our foundational workflow, and this workflow will control, will launch subflows depending on the other conditions defined in this catalog item. So for this example, I've focused only on approvals and only line manager approval for this one. So this catalog item is configured for line manager approval. I'm going to submit a request for this one. And once it's submitted, I'll show you the workflow context and we can see what's going on under the covers. Okay, so that request has been submitted. Just going to that RITM. Okay, so we can already see that an approval has been requested, and that is the user's line manager. I set Able Tutor's line manager to Abraham Lincoln. So if we show the workflow, we can see we have 3 attached, and none of these are actually the foundational workflow that will provide the actual fulfillment of the request. These are all just conditional workflows depending on the configuration of the catalog item. So our foundational approval workflow invokes our approval controlling workflow, and it could also perform other things. Actually, this is the approval workflow, sorry. Yeah, so we have a subflow for our approval controlling workflow. And we could also perform other prerequisite tasks before or after approval if required. But for this demonstration, we're just focusing on approvals. So this launched this workflow. And this workflow checks the catalog item to determine which type is appropriate. And for each type, it's recommended that you have another workflow. Just keeping it all modular and discrete makes maintenance much easier, and you can change things in isolation without affecting other elements of the system. So as you can see, Line Manager has launched its own workflow, and the Line Manager workflow is just a simple request for approval from a single user. So just to wrap this up, I will approve this request. Show the workflow again, and we can see that the actual fulfillment workflow has now been executed, and that is currently in progress. So that's my last demo.
All right, thank you, Dale. So as you can see, using this solution here, we've now got a reusable way to approve requests through our entire service catalog. So in our organisation, we've probably got about half a dozen different approval strategies. And instead of having to test that on every single service catalog item that we have, we've built it once and we can use that anywhere within our organisation. So some scripting tips. So when you're writing scripts, we've found that using script includes promotes the use of reusability, if written correctly that is, and maintainability. Consider how each script can be used for other use cases. Break down methods into logical functions that perform specific actions. So within a script, you might have something that generates a payload and then 2 separate methods, one for XML, one for JSON. So then that way, if you wanted to add another way to export that data down the track, then you can do that as well. Handle exceptions with meaningful errors. Right? It's so frustrating when something just doesn't work. and then you spend 20, 30 minutes trying to trace it. If you just put meaningful errors that get written to your log files, it's going to make it so much easier to troubleshoot in the future. And then use system properties. So this is about making it transportable. If you're an MSP, you want to make sure that you can write that code once and just use that script in another instance. Use system properties to drive the configuration attributes of that particular script. So in summary, you really need to define what good is within your own organization. Just because it works for you, for someone else doesn't necessarily mean it's right for you. Good code may, I find that it usually does, take a little bit longer to write than bad code, but it costs you much less in the long term. Invest up front in a good, scalable solution, and that'll pay off to no end in the future. A well-defined approach to managing and reusing code will keep your peers, management team, or peers and management team happy. Everyone's working from the same playbook. And critically, what we do isn't fixed. We haven't written this once, put it in a cupboard, and just referenced that same book over and over and over again. The ServiceNow platform grows and changes quickly. It's ever evolving. We need to make sure that our practices evolve as well. So the top takeaways. Document and maintain your own organization's best practice. Don't develop your code in isolation. You don't know what your peers are doing. You don't know how your requirements might change. And you don't know where the development is going to go in the future. And lastly, leverage ServiceNow features over customization. Just because you can do something in ServiceNow doesn't mean that you should. ServiceNow has so many features you can leverage. Check the APIs. Check the doc site. There is so much there that you can leverage that's going to make your life as a developer or as an implementer or as an admin so much easier. So just before we open up the floor to questions, feel free to grab us after the session or connect with us on LinkedIn or via email. Our email addresses are on the screen. Sure. All right, should we have some questions? I think, yeah, we've got about 7 minutes. Yeah, sure. So it really depends upon the type of code. So for something that you've built in a scoped application, we would import that into Git because we can easily import and export that into ServiceNow instances. For things that we don't use a scoped application for, we just maintain within Git as snippets.
Does that mean that all of your code is documented within Git? There's no central knowledge base. You're not in the ServiceNow knowledge base at all?
So we do have, so we've got a vendor instance which we manage all of our scripts with. But to make it easy to search, we also store it in other systems as well, so we can easily search across all of the customizations that we've made for all of our customers.
Yeah, we're also looking for better ways to document and contain all of our stuff. Looking for a better knowledge documentation portal, and currently looking into the Hugo static web page and the, I think it's called the doc type template, which gives you a very nice documentation site with script examples on the right-hand side. So Hugo and their templates are worth looking into.
You have any of the code that you were showing today on Glide Ajax?
So Smart Ajax, the first off the rank today, is available on the community forums. There are a couple of blog posts about that written by Paul Morris.
So if you search for Smart Ajax, you should find it.
how do you manage different versions of a script include, for example, across clients? Do you ever find you worked on one project, they had version 1.0 of a script include, you come back in a year, you've updated it and changed it over that past 12 months?
That's a good question. So we store our code with our clients as well as in our central repository. And even though we pull from our shared centralized repository, we are going to have to modify it in some way based on the client's needs. So we have our master. So we basically have two different models. We have our client and our primary internal version of that script. So if we update our internal one because we have some good new features to add to it, then we can notify our clients that are using it that they can also incorporate that into their versions if they like. So it's more of a notification thing. We try to keep things generic internally and then more specifically externally.
I suppose to that point as well, everything we develop for our customers, well, some of the things we develop for our customers, we might not want to then incorporate and promote more broadly. You know, so some customers can have some very, let's say, unique requirements, and we might choose to develop it for that customer, but then not incorporate that back into our central repository.
How do you keep your coding practices accessible?
No, sorry, could you repeat that question?
How do you keep your coding practices accessible and up to date to developers?
I think it's just through our own internal community and discussions. So we have our own Slack channel and everything, we're constantly discussing and trying to iterate and improve our processes. So if an update gets made to our architecture, then we'll all know about it because we will usually have some input into it as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.